All right, here we go. Hello everybody and welcome! I can finally show you my sit-down interview with Kerbal Space Program 2's creative director Nate Simpson. The interview was recorded shortly after Nate had presented the upcoming Force Science update for KSP2 at this year's Space Creator Day. A great event organized by space fans for space fans and that I had the privilege to be part of. But there were problems.
If we look at the
But despite that, we managed to pull it off regardless. If you are interested in how the development of Kerbal Space Program 2 progresses, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because I will follow that very closely, as I have for the past few years. I will also release a video on some of the up-and-coming space tech companies that were part of Space Creator Day, a deep dive into the Soviet space shuttle Buran that was exhibited next door to the event, and a general recap of the event itself. Lots of content coming! Channel members and patrons have a chance to get early access to those before they are released to everyone else. Okay, you waited long enough, enjoy the interview and let me know what you think about my questions and Nate answers in the comments below. Nate Simpson, welcome. Thank you for doing this interview. We're here at the Space Creator Day 2023 and you just came out of your presentation for patch 015 and more importantly the Force Science update, which is going to be released in December and going to finally integrate science and the tech tree and whatnot into Kerbal Space Program 2. So when you say December, are we talking more like beginning of December, or are we talking more like Christmas present?
So I can't give a precise date. If I could have, I would have in the presentation. I can give you the context that we're not going to want to be working over the holidays. Obviously, we want to give ourselves a little bit of latitude. As with previous updates, occasionally things pop up during QA and you need to nail them down. So we're trying to give ourselves a little bit of wiggle room there.
The crowd reaction was pretty positive, and you also had a long stream of fans lining up at your stand you had at this show. So this crowd is, of course, a lot of space-focused guys who probably also are long-standing KSP fans. But if we look at the current reviews on Steam, then things are not as positive as it might seem based on the reaction today. There's like this formula: disappointment is expectation minus reality. Was the disappointment that the fans showed within this review something you expected, or was it something that caught you by surprise?
It's a good question. I mean, I talk about it a little bit in the presentation itself, right? That we spoke a lot about what the game would become, especially in a lot of the trailers that we released. So everyone's very excited about future features, right? Colonies, Interstellar, multiplayer. And obviously the day-to-day reality is that the game is still moving through early access and we didn't even have the entire flight loop, right? We didn't even really have re-entry heating, for example. And I understand, I think the work takes the amount of time that it takes. And I think if I have a time machine, managing those expectations in advance is probably something that would have saved us some frustration. And by us, I mean us as the community. I'm speaking as a fan in this moment. I think it might be valuable to talk a little bit about process, because I think a lot of the advancements that we've made over this year, besides continuing obviously to release these periodic updates that improve the state of the game, really just changing the way that the team functions. Partway through the year, we adopted a feature team structure, each feature team has its own product owner, and it's a much less top-down kind of production-driven process and a much more bottom-up process where the people who are making the task estimates, for example, are people who are intimately familiar with the systems being scoped. Okay. So where, at the beginning of the year, I think in many cases, we would look at a list of to-do items and do our best in those triage meetings to say, well, we're going to do them in this order and we think that they're going to take this long. I mean, just to take a random example, mirrored procedural wings in VAB. We had a bug at one point, and again, nominally, mirror symmetry is working for 98% of parts, right?
Yeah.
But and then you have an item on the list listed as a bug to be fixed that says fix mirror symmetry on procedural wings. The person who, maybe it's somebody who's actually only been working on the VAB and who isn't intimately familiar with procedural wings in that particular meeting, and then they look at this item and they go, okay, I think that's probably some number of weeks, right, or whatever. They make an estimate based on the information they have in the moment. And then you discover, as you begin to work on that feature, that it has additional bugs. Oh, well now it's actually acting weird with the part coloring system, or the collision's being a little strange, or the center of pressure is misaligned, or this is it's a categorically different kind of part that is beginning to generate, because it touches so many adjacent systems, it's beginning to sort of generate new tasks as if by magic. This game is made out of that kind of task. Everything touches everything. Maybe the even deeper irony is that this starts as a single line on a list of to-do, turns into a lot of work that takes longer than we expect, and then when we finally do get it fixed and it goes on the patch notes for the update, it's just one line again.
Right.
It just says fixed mirroring on procedural wings. That was a long way of saying it's a complicated game that can often have a very winding path to a solution.
And how did you manage to, from what I'm hearing, you are claiming now that you have improved the situation internally?
Yes.
So basically, if I understood you correctly, like a year ago or so, a person that not necessarily would be even familiar with a feature would give an estimate, and based on this estimate, the team would start working. But if I understood you correctly, now you have these feature teams which are more familiar with what they're working on. So an estimate from those guys, for instance, procedural rings, would be more realistic than what you had in the past.
Right, and importantly, a feature team is cross-disciplinary. You'll have a bunch of people aimed at a feature, but who have intimate knowledge of different aspects of that feature. Right. And again, you have a much more bottom-up, sort of we know what needs to be done here, we can speak to the scale of what we're undertaking, and the estimates, the quality of the estimates are improving quite a bit. I mean, you can even sort of tell from the amount of stuff that's in the For Science update that we are becoming a more efficient, a more effective team, and part of that is about, we've always been working fast. There's a lot of very, very smart, very capable, very passionate people on the team, but now we are also able to, I think, kind of manage expectations more effectively.
Speaking of managing expectations, if you say you were working fast, the game was announced for 2020.
Yeah.
And we had the first release now in February, and the science is only coming almost 10 months later in December. Yeah. So people are starting to get, I would say, impatient. Yeah. With the pace of development. Now, as you said, the game is very complex, and to that complexity, I'd like to ask you something very specific, because when we last spoke in person, that was 2019 in Seattle at the PAX West event, I gave you my main gripe with Kerbal Space Program, and that was performance. And one of the reasons that performance in KSP1 was not as good as it could be was how fuel is drained from a vehicle and put out of the engine. And we still have the same issue in Kerbal Space Program too, that if you have 50 vector engines on a build, for instance, that was something that I did recently, then the performance was slow to almost a crawl. Yeah. And once you shut off thrust, the performance would immediately increase by 20, 30 FPS. So it is something from a decade-old game, and it's still in a supposedly new game. Can you speak to this holdover code that you still have from KSP1? How much is there still in there, and what are you going to do to get rid of it?
So I'm not an engineer, so my answer is going to be holistic. It's my understanding that there is no holdover code at all in that system, that we are organically encountering the same challenges that KSP1 is facing, because we are attempting to simulate fuel flow across some, in some cases, some very complicated rigid body trees, right? Like, and not only that, but it's happening on the sim side, right? Which means it's also happening for every vehicle to some extent. So I think the problem arises because of the complexity of calculating resource transfer across parts. It is not a solved problem for us yet. It is an area of research right now. You saw the results of the research that we have been doing around wobbly rockets, but this is definitely a thing that I've heard come up in meetings recently. The other thing that you'll see is that we do follow a triage process where we're working on what we regard to be, number one, the most foundational bugs that are preventing other systems from working, or we're working on things that the community highly values. And at the moment, I actually think that is one of the remaining tall poles. I would say wobbly rockets probably a higher priority, but this is a thing that is now becoming a high priority now that we're getting some of those other foundational things out of the way.
To reiterate that again, you're claiming that there is no code reused from KSP1 and KSP2?
Many of the same engineers are working on KSP2 as working on KSP1. I cannot make a categorical statement that nobody has copy-pasted any code between KSP1 and KSP2. My understanding, not being a person who can actually look at code myself, is that there is little to no reuse. Perhaps if other people are performing a forensic examination of the code base and they've determined that there is significant reuse, I would be very curious to hear about that.
Right. Because there was something curious that happened to me. It was in the very first early access version, 0.10. I encountered a bug that I last encountered in Kerbal Space Program 1.1, which was released in 2016, which made me wonder, and that's actually the reason of this line of questioning.
Can I speak to that a little more? I think if a feature could be effectively replicated at relatively low cost by duplicating it from KSP1, I would be eager to do that. That one of the things that has made KSP2 complicated is it's very rarely possible, even theoretically, to do that because the underlying systems are so different.
All right, I'm afraid I need to interrupt the video at this point. You see, this is what happens when you have two people that aren't software engineers talk about code reuse. When I mentioned this bug I talked about, Nate was thinking about core technologies like the fuel flow we talked earlier. But the bug in question was this. See the gizmo orientation for the landing leg? It appears that it tries to point along the axis of the extended part in KSP1 1.1 on the left side and KSP2 on the right side. Since a lot of software development nowadays relies on libraries, frameworks and these sort of things, both games apparently use the same middleware for the underlying Unity engine, something called Vehicle Physics Pro. And this caused the rotation gizmo to align on the axis of the extended leg in both games. So while Nate's answer is correct in regards to core components, some things on the side, as you will, can be similar or maybe even the same as in KSP1, especially when it comes to third-party integrations. Alright, back to our conversation. Let's say a little bit on the technical side. You mentioned Unity 2022.
2022 for the .15 update?
Right, for the .15 update. There was this hubbub about Unity wanting to introduce a new payment scheme. What was the reaction within the team when that news came public, and did you consider pivoting to a completely new engine? Or was it more like pulling all your hair out when you heard that the first time? Obviously it caught us somewhat by surprise. I'm sure in the company Slack there was a certain amount of speculation, like, does this affect us? Is this going to be a problem? But yeah, we immediately followed up and realized that it wasn't actually going to be meaningful for our arrangement with Unity. Okay. But can you imagine if we had to remake the game in another engine? How would that have gone over? Well, a few more years to the roadmap, I guess.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, you outlined the roadmap for science, so it's roughly December. The further big steps we have on the roadmap are Colonies, Interstellar, and then of course multiplayer. So can we expect the same roughly 10-month time frame for the upcoming features? Do you have like any type of roadmap you're willing or available to share?
We just had a conversation about managing expectations.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely loath to commit to a date. I think it's safe to say that we would be pretty disappointed if the amount of time between the For Science update and the Colonies update was the same as the distance between launch and For Science. I do think we were working on a lot more foundational stuff over the course of the first 8 months of the project, and that a lot of that stuff is getting squared away. So it should, in my opinion, come faster.
So based on the information you currently have, right?
Based on the estimates that I've seen, based on the scope of work for the Colonies update, I believe we are looking at a significantly shorter turnaround time.
We mentioned the feature teams earlier, and I seem to remember in the presentation you said that there have been teams dedicated to the For Science update. What sort of percentage of your entire engineering staff is working on upcoming features, and what percentage is working on stabilizing the core gameplay and fixing bugs?
That's a pretty hard question to answer categorically because people get assigned to different tasks at different times, even over the course of a single sprint. Yeah, I don't even know that I could speculate. That would probably be a question for someone on the engineering team. Maybe that's something that's different from engineer to engineer. I don't know. I have heard that the optimal balance is, I've heard some people aspirationally say 70% structural, paying down tech debt, and 30% new feature work.
Right.
And that seems great from an aspirational standpoint. I think probably the reality is a little bit more down the scale toward 50-50.
If we say 50-50 of the entire team, how big actually is the entire team? Because there is this curious thing when you look at the credits of KSP2, it lists like dozens, almost 90 people. But then I talked to one of your guys and they said, okay, that's kind of outdated information. And I found from your former technical director, Paul Furio, on LinkedIn, he claimed he grew the team from 4 to 20 engineers. So how many software engineers or engineers in general are currently actually working on the code?
I should have done a head count because I've been asked this question so many times today.
Okay.
I think probably the question to some extent it's sort of a side effect of this erosion of trust that's taken place over the course of the year, right? People are saying, if it seems to have taken so long to deliver the For Science update, what were you guys doing, right? And to some extent, the For Science update answers that question. There's quite a lot of work that's been going on over the course of the year. I don't know the number. And I worry that if I say a number, it'll be wrong. So, yeah.
Ballpark, less than 30.
If the concern is that the team is getting smaller, or that we're tightening budget strings,
I would just like to gauge. Okay, what can you actually expect from in sense of output? Because if there's like 100 people in the credits, then understandably fans will say, hey, so many people are working on it, why is the output so low? But if we say, okay, it's only 20 people or 25 people or something in that ballpark, it gets more understandable that the output cannot match, of course, what a 100-person team would be able to produce.
Yeah.
So coming back to the managing of expectations.
It's not a 100-person team.
Yeah, so we established that, but it's apparently more than 20, but less than 30?
No, I wouldn't even say more than 20.
Okay.
I can't give you a number there. I don't
roughly
know the answer.
That ballpark. I mean, you added apparently 2 new people, BlackRack and Anth.
That's correct.
Congratulations on that. Both excellent people I've had the privilege to talk to, and they're doing great work. So expecting great things from both of them. In the presentation where you said you improved the terrain generation from like 8 milliseconds to 1 point something milliseconds. Is this already based on that concurrent binary tree or CBT system that Warthog alluded to?
Yeah, that work is still down the pipe.
Right.
This is entirely, at least the mesh bucketing solution in particular, is entirely an optimization of the existing PQS system. Functionally, what was happening is we have a bunch of different biome layers, and we were rendering all of them all the time, even when they weren't locally visible. So, you could be at the equator of Kerbin, and it's still trying, somewhere in there, it's still thinking about the polar ice cap.
Right.
And so, essentially, it's just breaking up the terrain into areas that only have a couple of a couple of biomes visible, and then those are the only ones that we're rendering in that area. Of all the performance changes that have taken place over the course of early access, it's the one that I personally noticed subjectively the most. When that change went in, and again, this is very specific to whether your machine is CPU limited or GPU limited, and everyone's having a different experience.
Sure.
But my experience on my machine, which by the way, is not a high-spec machine. I now insist on testing the game on a relatively low-spec machine so that I'm getting an accurate sense of what the game's like for most people. I saw a significant bump in frame rate.
Right. Okay. Well, the big claims, you also showed us graphs today from I think one was labeled original and one was labeled sim transform, which is an interesting name that doesn't tell us anything yet.
Yeah, I know. And I wanted to be able to speak in some detail about what's improved there. I even grilled David and Mark Jones and David Tregening last week to try to get a better sense of exactly how that system works. And it is slightly over my head. Probably a great opportunity for a future dev blog. I think, in fact, there will likely be a dev blog on this subject because there is a lot of meat on that bone. But it has something to do with something that we've been referring to historically as the Kerbal transform system that is tracking velocity, angular velocity, position, orientation for everything in the game. And that thing was not completely utilizing all the cores in a multi-core setup. So this is apparently using the CPU far more efficiently.
Right.
And that, again, seems to be yielding some pretty big performance improvements. We're actually seeing there's a thread in Slack right now. We're seeing so many performance improvements occurring concurrently that it is getting hard to tell which ones to take the credit for. Yeah.
That is a very big claim, and it's going to be up to all the players that will receive that update later this year to decide whether or not that claim is true. You sold the update really well. There was cheers and applause in the auditorium today, but the team has to deliver, right? You're the creative director, but from my understanding of how game development works, the creative director is not really directly the boss of all the engineers, right? So
that is correct.
The person that has been doing what we talked about, the organizational changes, getting the estimations better, the feature teams, etc., and also the person responsible for quality, I would assume, is not something that is in your line of reporting. So you can't order them around.
Yeah, this isn't an ordering around kind of situation. I do want to call out, we have some pretty impressive people in those product owner positions.
Hey, it's me again. Sorry for interrupting a second time, but in a follow-up conversation to this topic, I received some additional information on these cross-disciplinary feature teams, as Nate called them, and their product owners, so I think it would be valuable to include it here. Apparently, there are 4 feature teams named Jab, Val, Bill, and Bob, which I think is rather adorable. Product owners for these are Tom Venita, some of you may know him as the It's Friday Man, Shana Markham, Chris Adderley, also known as Nertea, while Bob is focused on core technologies with the responsibility shared between Dave Tregoning and Mark Jones. Then there's also a VFX and the sound team with Mike Sawitsky and Howard Mostrom in key positions there. So, now you know how KSP2 development is set up. I'll leave me and Nate to it again.
They're all doing an amazing job. And in some ways, I sometimes feel a little bit orphaned because the team is beginning to kind of stand up on its own. And so I may have been in the past a little bit intrusive or, kind of stick my nose in things because trust is a thing that's built within a team as well as it's built with the community, right? And they have really blown me away with the stuff they've been able to achieve over the last few months.
So one of the big questions still left before your presentation was wobbly rockets, because that was, I asked my community whether they have any questions for you, and like every second question was, how are they going to fix the wobbly rocket situation? From what we've seen today in the presentation, it should get a lot better, so we're going to test that once it's out. One of the other things is that people are getting scared or like nervous that because of the initial reaction to the early access, and we're kind of circling back around to the beginning and now at the end of the interview, that the publisher might pull the plug because of the negative reaction, and they don't see any future or any future potential profits, and therefore will pull the plug before the game is even finished. Is this something you can address at the moment, or some, let's say, reassurance you can give to the community?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to get the plug pulled. This was, at the beginning, you've even heard me say in some interviews that we've understood that this is a long-tail project with a very passionate, very committed fan base. Sometimes that passion manifests as frustration or impatience, which is completely understandable. I would be more worried if they stopped complaining, right? If they suddenly got quiet, then that would mean, oh boy, now there isn't a desire to see this game succeed. But in fact, what we're seeing is that people are very, very passionate about this thing getting to where we promised it would get. So we're fine, we're funded, we're gonna be fine.
Okay.
And I do think it'll be a huge relief to get the game to a place in the For Science update where it is speaking for itself, right? You are absolutely right saying that you can't necessarily take my word for it, that you want to actually experience it to see if the performance is improved, to see if all these things are actually good. I cannot wait for it to be able to show you what we've achieved, because I do think that'll help us all be a little bit more excited about that next big beat that's coming down the road.
Well, in that case, I hope for all of us, Christmas comes early. Thanks,
Awesome.
Nate, for your time.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. And I really hope I got all of that.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more and follow me on my social thingies. The links are in the description. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.